Launch attempt will be August 29th with planned splashdown of October the 10th. Charlie Blackwell Thompson and her team at the Launch Control Center at Kennedy Space Center will hand over the vehicle once they launch that vehicle and unleash the 8.8 million pounds of thrust. We'll start our journey. If we could have the graphic there. Once we start the liftoff and the vehicle clears the tower, we'll start a roll program that will bring the Orion capsule to a heads-down position, much like we did in shuttle. About a minute into the flight, we'll experience our maximum dynamic pressure, and so the four core stage engines will throttle down for that period. Throttle back up, and then about 2 minutes into the flight, the solid rocket booster motor engines will expend their fuel, and they will detach from the core stage, splash down in the Pacific. The Atlantic. We continue on to another about 3.5 minutes or so. The service module panels will jettison along with the launch abort system, and those will expose the solar rays on the service module and the capsule of Orion, the command module. Continuing on further throughout the flight until about 8.5 minutes, where we will have main engine cutoff, and after main engine cutoff, we'll separate the core stage from the combined Orion and upper stage or interim control upper stage, interim propulsion control upper stage. That will continue on then to about 18 minutes MET, mission elapsed time. We'll deploy the Orion solar arrays to provide power to the batteries. That'll take about 12 minutes to deploy. We'll continue on to our first burn that is going to be performed by the upper stage. That's called the perigee raise maneuver. The core stage puts us in an orbit that's a 16 nautical miles by 975 nautical mile orbit. So if we did nothing at that point to correct the perigee side or the small side, that 16 nautical mile orbit, the whole capsule would come back to the Earth, just like the core stage is going to do in the Pacific. We'll perform that perigee raise maneuver to 100 nautical miles at approximately 51 minutes into the mission. The whole time, the upper stage will be in control of the stack. In the interim, it'll be doing several maneuvers to get to a solar-friendly attitude for the Orion spacecraft. It'll also do some roll maneuvers to make sure that the whole vehicle is thermally conditioned. Pressing on forward, once we have attained a safe orbit with the perigee raise maneuver, we'll continue on, and our final maneuver by the upper stage will be the translunar injection orbit maneuver by the upper stage. That will be at approximately an hour and 20-30 minutes into the flight. That'll be about an 18-minute burn, and will send us all the way to the moon, approximately 250,000 miles away. And once we completed the translunar injection maneuver and separate the upper stage from the Orion spacecraft, then my team will hand over to Rick, and he'll start the majority of the mission there. So Rick, you want to talk about that?
All right. And if we could go to the next chart, please. So there's really no time to catch our breath. We really hit the ground running. As you'll see on this first chart, after we separate from the upper stage, it actually does a disposal burn, which sends it on a trajectory to the moon, a heliocentric, which is it'll swing around the moon and then head towards the sun. And on its way to the moon, it actually will be deploying a handful of 10 CubeSats, their secondary payloads. We have no interaction with those secondary payloads. The only thing we're concerned with is their initial trajectories, where they're being deployed, so we can do an assessment on a potential recontact. Everything should go nominal when there's no concern, but we need to make sure that their trajectory is what we expect. So with that, I want to get away from this chart. Let's go to the next chart. We'll take off the ICPS piece of it. So. I'm going to talk through a lot of this. You know, it's 42 days, and I'm going to try and do it in just a handful of minutes. So, by all means, there'll be plenty of time to ask questions after we're all finished here. So I said we hit that first day, we hit the ground running. One of the first things we're going to do is we have to do a test of our guidance and navigation control system. There's a set of gains that are used and the way they fire the thrusters in our normal attitude control. And we need to make sure those gains are set such that we don't damage our solar arrays. So we're going to be doing that right after. That's one of the first things we do once we separate. And then we're also on that first day going to do the first of a handful of outboard trajectory correction burns. And this very first one, we're going to actually be checking out the orbital maneuvering system. It's the big engine that we'll be using. We want to check that out because that's the big burn. That's the engine we're going to use when we do the big burn on the outbound powered flyby as we go by the moon. And I'll talk about that a little bit shortly. But that first burn, like I said, it's a checkout. It also will get us moving ahead of the upper stage and those satellites. So we should get to the moon somewhere on the order of 2.5 hours before the satellites and the upper stage do. So that's why there's no really concern of recontact. So on our way to the moon, like I said, we'll be doing a series of these outbound trajectory corrections. They're very small. Or at least they're designed to be small. If we end up having dispersions because a burn didn't go as planned, then we'll make it up in a subsequent burn. I think we have 4 of those on the way to the moon, and those all set us up for what I said is the outbound powered flyby. That's the big burn that will actually move Orion, then it'll send it up to the distant retrograde orbit. So when we do that burn and we go by the moon, we're going to be about 60 miles off the surface of the moon. It's going to be spectacular. We'll be holding our breath, but yeah. And to that note, when that burn actually executes, Orion will be on the other side of the moon, and we won't have time with it. So we'll be praying and holding our breath, but confident that all will go well. So after that burn, like I said, it sends us up to the distant retrograde orbit. A couple days after that burn, we will do what we call an insertion burn. It's a distant retrograde orbit insertion. We'll also use that big engine, the OMS engine, to enter the distant retrograde orbit. And then once we're in the distant retrograde orbit, we're going to spend a little over 2 weeks there. You've heard us talk about long class missions and short class missions. The only difference in those 2 types of missions are the length of stay in the distant retrograde orbit. For a short class mission, we just do a half a lap, and then we head back towards the moon. For the long class, we do a full lap and a half, and it's a little over 2 weeks. While we're in the distant retrograde orbit, we'll be doing what we call orbit maintenance burns. They're small burns just to keep our orbit in sync. We'll do that over the course of the next 2 weeks, and then we'll do what we call a distant retrograde departure burn. It's another large burn that uses the OMS engine, and that'll send us back to the moon. And on our way back, now we're doing what we call return trajectory corrections, RTCs, and we'll do a series of those all the way back to Earth. So we have a couple of those. Then that sets us up for the return power flyby. That is our most critical burn of the mission. If something happens with that one and we don't execute it, then it's a loss of the Orion capsule. We have to do that one. But we plan accordingly. We have down mode capabilities, and we can talk about that if you have questions. But so we do the RPF, which actually sets up the entry interface. That's the area where when we enter the atmosphere several days later, and sets up our splashdown off the coast of California. On the return trip back to the Earth, we do a series of these correction burns that I talked about, and it's all to make sure that we hit that entry interface target as designed. And I've gone through the mission very quickly, just so you know. On those days where we're coasting to the moon, we're doing a lot of activities. We're doing a lot of developmental flight test objectives to just basically test out the onboard systems. We're doing a public affairs outreach event every day where we maybe maneuver, do a selfie of Orion with the moon in the background or the Earth in the background. On some days we're going to try and catch the Earthrise. That's a spectacular image. There's a couple milestones throughout the mission where we actually enter the sphere of influence of the lunar, where the lunar gravity really starts taking effect.